Hello, this video is about how to graph using Google Sheets. You can see I've got my spreadsheet in front of me here, and my goal is to be able to calculate the batting average for the Chicago Cubs. Now, if you don't know anything about baseball, you're in good company. I don't really either. Batting average, as you can see right here, batting average is calculated by taking the hits out of the at-bats, meaning every time they go up to plate, how often do they hit the ball? We can look at it like as a percentage. I guess a 30% of the time you hit the ball is a pretty good one. So, what we're going to find out is what's the batting average for the Chicago Cubs. Now we could take every player and divide hits over at bats, and be able to find out what each player is and then average all of them together. But actually graphing is a better way to go. It's a more accurate way to find things. So I'm going to talk about that more in the second video after I make the graph and can kind of show you the difference. This video is just about making the graph, putting what's on X and what's on Y, the most important part, and then putting in the labels. So that's what this video is about. Okay. So the toughest part is to decide what's on X and what's on Y, kind of like who's on first and who's on second. And it makes me think about slope. Now our goal is to find the batting average, which is going to be the slope of our graph. So we're going to make an XY scatter plot, and the slope of the line will be equal to our batting average. Anytime you have some sort of ratio, which batting average is, batting average we know is to be hits over at-bats. Anytime you have that kind of ratio, you can be making a graph to find the slope, and the slope will allow you to find a semi-average. Once again, I'll talk about the difference between slope and average in the second video. Now, when we think about slope, slope is rise over run. How much do you go up is how much do you go over, so it's rise divided by run. And we know rise is what happens on the y-axis, and run is what happens on the x-axis. So if we want our batting average to equal our slope, well then, I don't want to do that. To equal our slope, yes, I see there's a problem. Our slope is rise over run, and our batting average hits it over at bats. So if I want my slope to equal my batting average, my hits has to be on the y-axis, and my at-bats has to be on the x-axis. That way I have rise as my hits over run as my at-bats. Anytime you make a graph in Google Sheets, you're going to have your y-axis, which in this case is my hits, be in column B, and your x-axis has to be in column A. I just so happen to have that. So the first column has to be X, and the second column has to be Y. Since I have that going on, delete these two so they're not being counted in the graph. You can see I've got all my numbers. Something important about the numbers is you can only have numbers. Like you couldn't have this say 442 grams or 442 milliliters if you were doing something in the lab. It can only have numbers. The computer can't understand numbers and units. So any units you wanted to have could be in these labels up here. And the labels are going to be important parts too, because they're going to affect our graph shortly. I'll show you that part. Okay, so let's make the graph. Now that I've got my at-bats, which is my x-axis in column A, and my hits, which is y-axis in column B, I'm ready to go. I'm going to insert my chart. Now the computer will kind of guess what kind of graph you want. This is not what I want. I want to find something with a slope in the line, and that's going to be the scatter plot. 99% of the time in this class we're going to be making a scatter plot. Something that's good about this is you can use row 1 as headers. So you can see row 1 is my at-bats and hits. That's why that part's important. So that's what this legend is going to show, and that'll come into play shortly. I'll insert my graph. Alright, now something you can notice is this guy right down here. What is he doing down there? It seems kind of weird, right? So if you look at him, he's number at 250, and really low number. So if I find him, he's 250 and a 5. What this player did is he went up to the plate 250 times, but he only hit the ball 5 times. Now, is that possible? Yeah, he could be the pitcher or something, a pretty terrible player, or that's like me going up to the plate. But it's more likely that something happened in here, an error happened. So in your lab, you'll have errors that come up where just maybe you spilt it or you didn't even know what you did at the time, and then you think back and you realize what you did. Errors always happen. But you have to include those data points and talk about them in the error section. So what I'm going to do is delete this 5, but not forever. The 5 can't just go away forever. I'm going to put it over here. This is in a new column, and I'll call it the outlier. And in this column, the outlier column, I'll be able to put it back into the graph, but it'll be in a different series, so it won't affect my blue dots, or my original series here. So let's go to my advanced edit. I got to include my outlier dot. If you go back to your chart types, you'll see that my chart is only going to be charting anything in column A and column B. So it hasn't looked at anything in column C yet, which is where my outlier is. So I'm going to put in column C. So now it's taking everything in a box from like A2 all the way to the corner of C16. Give that an update, and there you can see that the outlier is in there. And in fact, since I labeled the column, it's called the outlier. Now I might want to call this blue dot something a little different other than hits. I could call it like Chicago Cubs, and then my outlier of the Chicago Cubs. That works pretty good. Alright, that's a good looking graph so far. We've got to put in some titles and some labels. So Advanced Edit is a great place to go. You notice it says right little click, Advanced Edit. That's where you want to go to find everything. Now it kind of guessed what it wanted from my chart title. Not that great. Chart titles should be really beefy, nice and long in length. If you see down here, a title kind of has two functions. It has its purpose, and then you want to describe what's on Y and what's on X. By just saying hits versus at-bats, you kind of wonder, like, is the hits on the Y or is the hits on the X? When you use that term versus, we don't really know what it means. And we also want to include the purpose. So the purpose of this whole graph was to find the batting average for the Chicago Cubs. So I'm going to start there. Chicago Cubs batting average. I'll put in a colon. So I've got my purpose. And now the second part of my title, I want to include what's on Y and what's on X. On the Y-axis, I have hits. And I could say hits versus at-bats, but then you really don't know what's on Y and what's on X. It doesn't make much sense. If you say hits as a function of at-bats, that term as a function of tells you that hits is the Y and at-bats is the X. It's kind of like when you hear in math class, Y is a function of X. That's exactly what it's telling you, what's on Y and what's on X. So in this case, instead of saying Y is a function of X, I said hits, which is my Y, as a function of my X at-bats. So you don't have to title graphs this way, but your graphs do need to include the two big things. One, what's your purpose of doing this graph, my batting average, and two, what's on Y and what's on X. So if you want to do it in a different way, that's fine. This I find to be the easiest way. If I just keep it to a set pattern, I tend to do a pretty good job. Okay, let's look at our labels here. I got my horizontal axis. My horizontal axis is my X, and that's my at-bats. Now normally you'll have to have like some sort of units. Like if you had volume, you'd say milliliters, something like that. And that would be where you put in parentheses here. Now clearly at-bats doesn't really have any units, but you can imagine in chemistry class that we would. On the vertical axis I have hits. So if you had something like grams, you'd have to put units of grams. Clearly I don't have that again here. Alright, well I've got my y-axis labeled, my x-axis labeled. It's looking pretty great. I'll update it. And there we go. There's the basics of the graph. In the second video, what I'm going to talk to you about is actually solving our problem, our Chicago Cubs batting average. This graph I haven't quite solved for the slope yet. So we're looking at the slope of the line, we're going to find the equation of the line, and we're going to talk about what average it means and doesn't mean and why this outlier thing is so important. I'll see you in the second video.